Welcome everyone to part 2 of our video lesson workshop, the Garden Rope Workshop Project. In this hands-on portion, we will make sure that you have your yarn ready. A quick note before we get started. The great thing about a video workshop like this is you can pause the video at any time if I'm going too fast for you, as well as navigate back to previous portions of the video. So go at your own pace, pause as needed, rewind as needed. Take your time to ensure that it goes as smoothly for you as possible. Before we begin the finger crochet process, let's first prep our yarn. For best results with the Garden Rope project, we need to use multiple strands of yarn at the same time. Ideally, these multiple strands of yarn are also relatively thick, what's called a worsted weight yarn. So not super thin yarn like a sock kind of yarn or cobweb weight, really thin like thread. That's going to be harder for you to use. Focus on yarns that are a little bit thicker, say a worsted weight, which can be about the same strand size as, say, a thin rope, all the way up to a bulky or super bulky yarn, which can be more like a thick rope size. Now, when you're using multiple strands of yarn, between 3 and 4 strands typically works well. Whenever we crochet or knit, and whether we're using one ball of yarn or multiple skeins of yarn at once, it's easy for the yarn to roll all over our table or work surfaces, and that can become really frustrating. But there are a couple of great ways you can avoid this problem. One is you can grab a big mixing bowl or large plastic tub or something similar. Even a small sand pail or bucket should work just fine, and drop all of your yarn balls into it. Then take each strand of yarn, whether you're using 3 or 4 at once, and begin your crocheting or knitting project. For the most part, the yarn should bounce around in the bowl only and not roll all over your work surface. Another way to solve this problem is by creating what's called a reverse pull ball of yarn. The way to do this is find a strand of yarn connected to the original ball or skein, so how the yarn came when it was delivered to you or when you purchased it at the craft store. A couple of notes between a yarn ball or a skein of yarn or sometimes a hank. Sometimes it's called a hank. If you have a hank of yarn, it's going to be in a braided sort of twist. If you have a skein of yarn, it's going to be more like a log shape, an oblong log shape, and a ball is pretty self-explanatory. It's a round sphere of yarn. The ball may also be a bit more like a cylinder shape too. You can work with one ball of yarn at a time or multiple balls depending on what is easiest for you. First, you'll want to drape a long tail of that yarn down the middle of your palm, in between your thumb and pointer finger. I find it's easiest to do this with my non-dominant hand. For me, I'm right-handed, so I'll drape the yarn down my palm between my thumb and pointer finger on my left hand. Let this strand or tail of yarn be relatively long, about 3 or 4 inches, even a little more is just fine. Next, you're going to take the yarn that's still connected to your ball or skein or hank and begin wrapping around your thumb and pointer finger in a figure 8 motion. You'll want to do this process on the same hand. So my tail of yarn is resting against the palm of my left hand, and I'm wrapping the yarn in figure 8s on my left thumb and pointer finger. Wrap the figure 8s of yarn about 10 times plus or minus. Please wrap loosely so as not to cut off circulation in your fingers. This can happen, especially if you're someone who likes tight tension. Try to ease back a little bit, wrap a little bit more loosely, because we'll have to pull this yarn off of our fingers in a few moments. Once you've done the 10 wraps, again plus or minus is fine, pinch the yarn in the middle of the figure 8. You can envision your figure 8 like a bow in a person's hair, or a bow that adorns a gift box, and your pinching in the very center of the bow will help hold both sides of that bow together. Slide the yarn gently off your thumb and pointer fingers and fold that figure 8, or that bow of yarn, in half. You now have a little parcel of yarn with the original tail of yarn still sticking out. Take the yarn still connected to your ball and begin to gently wrap this yarn around your little bow or little parcel of yarn, however you like to think about it. You'll want to pay careful attention to the yarn tail that we started with though. This is a very important part. Please avoid wrapping around that yarn tail. This is where you will pull the yarn from when you get working on your project. You're going to be pulling the yarn from the inside and center of the ball, so you don't want to cover that tail. Otherwise, your reverse pull ball is no longer a reverse pull ball. Again, keep wrapping the yarn that's still connected to your ball or skein around and around your original bow, and do this gently. Try not to wrap too tightly, otherwise the yarn will become stuck inside the ball. As you wrap, you can keep changing the direction of the yarn so your reverse pull ball becomes ball shaped rather than lemon shaped. So if you keep wrapping your yarn, say around the same direction again and again, you end up with more of a football shaped ball of yarn instead of a sphere. It's a little easier to work with a sphere. For example, wrap around the bow of yarn about 10 times from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Then switch direction and wrap the yarn again approximately 10 times from around 2 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and so forth. Once you've wrapped all the yarn into a ball, being careful not to wrap over that original yarn tail, tuck in your last few inches of yarn into the ball. You now have a reverse pull ball. Begin working with the yarn by pulling on the original yarn tail that comes from the ball center. And since you're now pulling yarn from the inside of the ball rather than the outside, the yarn will no longer flop or roll around at your workstation. This really helps a lot. Okay, so we've done all of our prep work. It takes quite a bit. Hopefully that worked out for you, and if the reverse pull ball doesn't work out for you, again, try that first suggestion that I mentioned. Put all of your balls into a bowl or something similar to that and let them roll around inside of there. Again, this process is supposed to be fun, so figure out what works best for you. Alright, now it's time to get going with the finger crochet process. Ideally, we want to begin with what's called a slip knot. To make a slip knot, you'll want to take a good length of yarn, probably between 1 foot, so 12 inches, to 18 inches. And an easy way to do this is what I do, is to use the length of my hand and my forearm. So I'll take the yarn and I'll measure it from the tips of my fingers all the way to my elbow. And for me, that is approximately, I'm taking a guess, maybe 14 inches or so. Might be a little bit longer for you or a little bit smaller, but it's a good way to measure your yarn strength. Okay, so once you've done that, now find the strand of yarn that is still connected to the yarn ball and gently thread this through the loop that you created. You can think of this almost like chain links. You're making a new chain link that goes through the first loop. Hang on to the loop you just created, and by that I mean the second loop, not the first, and pull both strands of yarn next to that loop downward. This will tighten the slip knot. Instead of 2 links in a chain, you'll have 1 loop again with a small knot at the base. What makes this a slip knot is you can adjust the size of the loop. Pull the strands of yarn to make the loop smaller, or place your fingers inside the loop and stretch it out to make the loop a bit larger. Now, sometimes making a slip knot can be tricky for beginners, whether the beginner is sighted or visually impaired. And if that's the case, and if you've tried to make a slip knot multiple times but it's not working and causing a great degree of frustration, don't worry. What you can do instead is make a good sized loop with your yarn, about the size of a large grape or a small key lime. Tie a knot at the bottom of this loop so the loop stays put. We don't want it to come out, to come undone, and then go from there. As long as you can fit your thumb and your pointer finger through the loop, it'll work okay. Once we have our loop, whether that's a slip knot loop or a basic loop, we can begin a crochet process called chaining. So again, using your dominant hand, place your thumb and pointer finger inside the loop, allowing just your fingertips to poke outward. And here's a quick note about dominant hands. In this video, I'll be demonstrating using my right hand because that is my dominant hand. But for those of you who are left-handed, I've made a reversed version of the video to help you visualize how to do this same process with your left hand. Next, using the tips of your thumb and pointer finger, pinch the strand of yarn still connected to the yarn ball and gently pull a new loop through the first loop. Again, you can think of chain links here, hence the name a crochet chain. Place your fingertips through the current loop, gently pull new yarn through, and create a new loop. If your new loop is a bit loose, gently tug on the yarn connected to the yarn ball to make it a bit smaller. You can also think of the chaining process like this, essentially 4 steps. Fingertips through the loop, pinch the yarn, pull the yarn through the loop, create a new loop. Or here's an even shorter version. Sometimes it helps to whisper or chant the steps to yourself until you develop the muscle memory to do it without even thinking. Fingertips, pinch, pull through, new loop, and repeat, repeat, repeat. You can keep going with your chain as long as you like until you run out of yarn. Once that happens, take the last little tail of yarn, thread it through the last loop in your chain, and tie a knot to keep everything from unraveling. Now you're good to go. You've just created a garden rope. Congratulations, and thank you so much for participating in the project. On behalf of Marcia Judd and me, Erin Schalk, thank you so much for participating in this virtual workshop. We look forward to seeing what beautiful fiber art you create.